Thank you, Pete. That was great. That was great. Wow. Okay, I'm going to make this shorter. There we go. Well, this story that I'm going to tell is actually told in many versions all around the world. But I learned it from a book called Grandfather Tales by Richard Chase. And he was in the southern Appalachian Mountains collecting stories and folktales and fairy tales in the 30s. And this came from the book Grandfather Tales. One time, long time ago, way up in the mountains, there lived a widow, had 2 daughters. And they kept them a hired girl, made her do all the heavy work, little as she was. And they never bought her any new clothes. And they made her sleep next to the fireplace, and she got covered in ashes and soot, and they called her Ash Pet. Now, one day, the widow and daughters were getting ready to go to church meeting. Now, they never let Ash Pet go anywhere. They knew she was prettier than them 2 daughters were. In fact, when people came to the house, they would hide her under a wash tub out in the yard. Well, this night, they were getting ready to go to church meeting, and something terrible happened. Their fire went out. Now, they didn't have lighters or even matches to light up a new fire. If your fire went out, you had to go borrow some fire from a neighbor. Now, the nearest neighbor to this family was over the gap. There was an old woman who lived in a log cabin all by herself, and people said she was a witch woman. But they had to have fire. Usually they wouldn't have anything to do with somebody like her, not rich people like them. Well, they had to have fire. So the widow, she told the oldest daughter to go over there and bring back some fire. Well, she didn't want to do it. She went flouncing and traipsing through the gap, got to the house, wouldn't even go inside. She ran her hand through a chink between the logs and the cabin wall, and she said, "I come for fire." And from inside, she heard a voice say, "Well, come in and comb out my hair for me, and I'll give you some." And that girl, she said, "Ooh, I'm not going to put my pretty clean hand on your old cat comb." And the voice said, "Well, you get no fire." And she went home empty-handed. Well, the widow sent the next daughter. She didn't want to go either. She went drag-footing through the gap, taking her sweet time. And then she got there, wouldn't go in the house either. She stuck her hand through that crack. She said, "I need some fire." And the voice said, "Well, come in and comb my long hair for me, and I'll give you some." And the girl said, "Ooh, I am not going to put my pretty clean hands on your old rat's nest. And the voice said, "Well, push off then. You'll get no fire." Well, she came home empty-handed. There was only one left to go, and the widow woman called out, "Ash Pet!" And Ash Pet, she went running as fast as she could through the gap in there, down to that log cabin. She knocked on the door and pushed that door open, and there was that little old witch woman sitting there. She said, "Good evening, Auntie." She said, and the old woman said, "Good evening, Ash Pet." And she said, "Ma'am, please, I've come for some fire. Our fire went out. Do you have any fire you could give me, please?" And she said, "You comb out my long hair, and I'll give you some." So Ash Pet grabbed up the comb and started combing that woman's long white hair, combed it all out. And when she was done, that witch woman, she picked up a dried up old toadstool, scooped into the fire, and had a coal right in the middle of it. That way Ash Pet could take it home without getting burned. And then she said, "Ash Pet, are you going to church meeting tonight?" Ash Pet said, "Oh, Lord, no. They never let me go anywhere. And by the time I get done washing all the dishes and scrubbing out the pots, well, church meeting will be over." The old woman said, "Would you like to go?" Ashpet said, "Oh, yeah, more than anything in the world I would." And the old woman said, "Well, those people get good and gone tonight, and I'll come by and help you, see if I can get you to church meeting." And Ashpet thanked her, and she took that coal of fire home. She had to build up all the fires. She had to do the milking and the feeding, and she still had supper to make. And after supper, she had to help those girls get ready to go to church meeting. Well, when they got off down the road around the first bend, Ashpet looked, and there came that old woman through the gap with a stick, walking with her stick. And she came up to the house and she said, "Good evening, Ashpet. I want you to stand right here by the door." And Ashpet stood there as that old woman took all the dirty dishes and plates and cups and forks and spoons, put them on one end of the table, and then she put a big tub of water on the other end and hit full of scalding hot water. And she took her stick and knocked it twice. "All dirty dishes, stay off the shelves. Jump in the water and wash yourselves. Shake, dish, shake." And all those cups and bowls and forks and knives and spoons went bumping across the table, jumped in that water, swished around a little bit, got out and dried themselves off, and they rolled back all up into the cupboards and the drawers and everywhere they belonged the whole time. Well, then that old woman, she took all those pots and pans, all of those, put them by the door, and she knocked again with her stick. "Pots and pans, handle and spout, jump in the creek and scour out. Scrub, pot, scrub." And they all went bumping out the door, down to the creek, right into the sand. They shook themselves around till they were as clean as you could ever hope to see them. Then they bumped their way back in and sat right down by the hearthstone. Well, Ashpet thought that was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. She just laughed and laughed. And the old woman said, "Ashpet, you still want to go to church meeting?" "Yes, ma'am." Well, out of her pocket, she took a little mouse and a piece of leather and a string of rawhide. And she set that mouse down outside the door, put the leather on, put the rawhide over, and she knocked her stick. "Go up, little mare. Whoa, now, whoa." And in the blink of an eye, that mouse turned in to the prettiest little pony you would ever want to see. Just as gentle as any girl would want, with a brand new saddle and bridle on it. Then that woman reached in her pocket again and pulled out a rag and 2 little scraps of shoe leather. Well, she took that rag and shook it out, laid it on the chair, banged those pieces of shoe leather together and stuck them underneath. And she said, "Ashpet, now you wish for just the kind of dress and shoes you want to wear tonight to church meeting, and then open your eyes." Ashpet closed her eyes and she wished, and when she opened them up, there was the prettiest little red dress she had ever seen. And on the floor were 2 of the littlest red slippers that she had ever seen. Well, she washed herself and put on that dress and those shoes, and she jumped on her horse. And the old woman said, "Now, Ashpet, you be back here straight after church meeting starts breaking up, and hide that pony in the woods, and hide your dress and your shoes, and they'll never know you were gone." Well, Ashpet thanked her and rode off down the road. She rode and rode down to the church house, tied up that pony, and she walked in the door of that church house, and every head turned. Everybody was looking at her. People started saying, "Well, who's that girl? I've never seen her before. My goodness, she's pretty. Where'd she ever come from?" Well, that night at church meeting, the king's son happened to be there. And when he set his eyes on Ashpet, he could not take him off. Well, after church meeting was over, Ashpet left as fast as she could, got on her pony, and started off down the road. Well, the king's son just had to know who this girl was. And he chased after her, got on his horse and rode up behind her, started talking to her, started joking, and they were laughing and talking. And Ashpet realized that she couldn't let him follow her all the way home. So after a little while, she eased off one of those red shoes and dropped it off in the brush by the side of the road. Went on and went on a little more, and then she said, "Oh, law, look, I have lost one of my red shoes. It must have fallen off back down there." He said, "Oh, don't you worry. I'll go get it. I'll find it for you. You just stay right here." And off the way he went, back the way they had come, and as soon as he was out of sight, Ashpet took off as fast as she could, got home, hid that pony in the woods, hid her dress and her one shoe, and she went back to sweeping and dusting. Well, that king's son, he looked and looked, and finally he found it. There it was, right there in the brush, like she said. And he picked it up, and he went back to where he'd left her, and she was gone. Well, he never got her name. Didn't know where she lived. But he, by golly, had to find her. He was in love, and he didn't know what to do. So he started around the whole countryside, taking that shoe, trying to fit it on to all the different girls, find the girl that he really loved. Well, he finally got to that widow woman's house, and they took Ashpet and they run her under the wash tub out in the yard. And he came in and he said, "Now, this shoe fits the girl I'm going to marry. So everybody's got to try it on. And whoever it fits, that's who I'm going to marry." Well, that oldest daughter, she grabbed that shoe, ran around the back of the house, tried to stuff her big old foot in there. It was not going to fit. She pulled out her knife, trimmed a little bit off of her heel, trimmed a little bit off of her toe. She made it fit. Well, when she went back around to the king's son, he looked at that foot. Well, it seemed to be in there all right. He looked at the other foot. Something wasn't quite right. Just about then, a little bird flew down to the doorway, and it sang out, "Trim your heel, trim your toe, under the tub the slipper goes." "What'd you say, little bird?" "Shoo, shoo," said the widow. "You get out of here," the widow woman said. Well, then he pulled off that shoe, and he saw where that girl had trimmed her heels, trimmed her toes. So the second girl, she grabbed it up and took it around the back, tried to put her foot in it too. No way it was going to fit. She had to trim off some of her heel and some of her toes. Well, she went back out and she showed the king's son her foot was in the shoe. He looked at it. He looked at her face. Something just not quite right about this. Well, that little bird flew back, started singing again. "Trim your heel, trim your toe, under the tub the slipper goes." "Shoo, shoo," said the widow. And that bird flew off and sat right on that wash tub. Well, that king's son, he took off that shoe and he saw where that other girl had trimmed her heel and toes. He knew she wasn't the right one. So he walked over to that wash tub, and the bird sang, "Trim your heel, trim your toes, under the tub the slipper goes." And when he lifted up that wash tub, there was Ashpet. He said, "What are you doing under here?" She said, "They always put me under here when people come to the house." He said, "Well, you come out of there now. You got to try on this shoe." And she said, "Oh, no, I'm too raggedy and dirty." He said, "No, you come on. He took that shoe and he slipped it right on her foot, and it fitted perfect. And when he looked at her, he realized she was the girl he loved. Well, she got all cleaned up, went and put on her red dress and both her little slippers, got her pony out of the woods, and she and the king's son rode off together and got married. And from what I heard, they both lived happy ever after. Thank you.